The dust motes danced in the slivers of late afternoon light, a silent, swirling cosmos in the stillness of his daughter's bedroom. David watched them from the doorway, a ritual he had performed nearly every day for 6 years. Each particle was a ghost of a moment, a memory of laughter or a hastily tossed sweater, a life interrupted mid-breath. The room remained a perfect, heartbreaking museum of September 2017. A half-finished book lay on the nightstand, its corner folded to mark a page that would never be turned. A poster of a band he could not name was tacked to the wall, its edges curling with age. Nothing had been moved, because to move anything would be to admit the passage of time, to accept that the girl who inhabited this space was not simply on a long trip, but was gone. 6 years. The words felt foreign in his mouth, a length of time too vast to comprehend yet too short to have extinguished the embers of his hope. 6 years since Sarah, his bright, fiercely independent Sarah, had vanished. She had been driving back to her college campus after a weekend visit, a simple 3-hour trip. She had called him from a gas station just off the interstate, her voice crackling with the cheerful static of a weak signal. She told him she loved him, that she would call when she arrived. The call never came. The investigation that followed was a blur of fluorescent lights, grim-faced detectives, and the suffocating sympathy of neighbors. Her last known location was the Summit Creek gas station, a lonely outpost on a stretch of highway flanked by dense national forest. Her transaction was on camera. Filling her tank, buying a bottle of water. She looked normal. She looked happy. She drove away, her little blue sedan swallowed by the winding road, and simply ceased to exist. They had searched. For weeks, helicopters had chopped the air, and volunteers in bright orange vests had combed the woods, their shouts echoing through the canyons. The local sheriff, a man named Brody whom David had known for years, had personally overseen the effort. But they found nothing. No car, no sign of a struggle, no trace. The case grew cold, filed away in a sad, thick folder that sat on a shelf in the county sheriff's department, a testament to a question with no answer. David's life had frozen with it. His work as a carpenter became mechanical, the motions of his hands disconnected from his mind. His wife, Sarah's mother, had succumbed to a quiet grief that eventually pulled her away, their shared sorrow a chasm too wide to bridge. She had moved to the coast 3 years ago, seeking a place where every corner did not scream their daughter's name. But David stayed. He could not leave. He was a sentinel at the tomb of his family, waiting for a sign that he knew, logically, would never come. The phone call that shattered the 6-year silence came on a Tuesday, under a sky the color of slate. It was not the sheriff's department. It was a young woman, her voice thin and breathless. She said she was a hiker. She and her boyfriend had been exploring an old, unmarked logging trail deep in the state park, miles from any main road. They had found a car, a small blue sedan, tucked away in a thicket of overgrown rhododendron. It was covered in 6 years of forest debris, rusted and grim. She had cleared the leaves from the license plate and run the number online. It was registered to Sarah Collier. David's heart seized, a painful, violent contraction in his chest. He gripped the kitchen counter, his knuckles white. The hiker kept talking, her words tumbling over one another. But one phrase cut through the noise, so bizarre and so impossible that he was sure he had misheard. "The weirdest thing," she said, her voice dropping to a confused whisper, "is the engine. My boyfriend touched the hood. It's still warm." The notion was absurd, a fever dream. A car, sitting abandoned for over 2,000 days, could not have a warm engine. It defied every law of physics and reason. It was the product of an overactive imagination, or the sun on the metal, or a simple mistake. But it did not matter. The car had been found. That was the only part that was real. After hanging up, David stood motionless for a full minute, the silence of his house pressing in on him. The dust motes in Sarah's room seemed to spin faster, energized by a sudden, terrifying surge of possibility. A piece of the puzzle had surfaced, and with it came a sliver of hope so sharp it felt like pain. He grabbed his keys, his hands trembling, and walked out of the house for the first time in 6 years without the feeling that he was leaving his daughter behind. The drive to the coordinates the hiker had sent was a journey through a landscape of ghosts. Every curve in the road, every dense stand of pine, was a place he had imagined, a place where the story might have ended. He passed the Summit Creek gas station, its paint peeling, its windows dark. It was a monument to the last known moment of her life. He pushed the accelerator, his gaze fixed forward. When he arrived, the area was already cordoned off with yellow tape, the flashing lights of 2 sheriff's cruisers painting the gray afternoon in strokes of red and blue. A young deputy, a woman with a serious face and hair pulled back in a tight bun, stopped him before he could cross the tape. He told her who he was. Her expression softened with a practiced pity he had come to despise. "Mr. Collier, we were about to contact you. I'm Deputy Evans. We've secured the scene. The state investigators are on their way." He looked past her, at the small, rusted shape of the car nestled in the greenery. It was her car. The faded blue paint, the dent on the rear bumper from a long-forgotten fender bender. It was a relic from another life. "The hiker," David said, his voice hoarse. "She said the engine was warm." Deputy Evans gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "The sun must have been on it, sir. Or they were mistaken. The vehicle is cold. The battery is completely dead. It's been here a long, long time." Of course it had. He knew that. And yet, the anomaly had been the hook that pulled him here, the strange detail that had made the impossible seem real. He walked closer, his feet crunching on the gravel. He saw Sheriff Brody standing near the vehicle, talking to another officer. Brody looked older, heavier. The lines on his face were deeper, etched by time and the burdens of his office. He saw David, and his expression shifted to one of weary solemnity. "David," Brody said, his voice a low rumble. "I'm so sorry you have to see this. We're going to process it thoroughly. We'll find out what we can." David didn't answer. He walked to the front of the car he had helped Sarah buy, and placed his palm flat against the hood. The metal was cold, not just cold, but the deep, settled cold of something that had not known heat for a very long time. The hiker had been wrong. A simple, explainable mistake. But as his hand rested on the cold steel, a different kind of wrongness settled over him. It was a cold, sharp-edged intuition that pricked at the base of his skull. He looked around. This logging trail was old, but it wasn't invisible. It was less than a mile from a maintained Park Service road. How had they missed this? He remembered the maps from 6 years ago, the grids laid out over the entire region, section by section. He remembered the assurances from Brody that every square inch had been covered. They had searched this area. He knew they had. So how could they have missed a car? "It was well hidden," Brody said, as if reading his thoughts. "Tucked way back in there. Easy to miss from the air, and the ground teams must have just passed it by. It's a big forest, David." David nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the surrounding woods, then the car, then the sheriff's face. The explanation was perfectly plausible. It was the most likely reason. But the intuition persisted, a low hum beneath the surface of Brody's reasonable words. The warm engine was a lie, a mistake. But it had brought him here. And now that he was here, he was beginning to wonder if the real lie was the one he had been told 6 years ago. That night, sleep was an impossibility. David sat at his dining room table, the single overhead light casting a harsh glare on the contents of a dusty cardboard box. It was his own personal cold case file. He had maps, timelines, copies of police reports he'd had to fight to get, and his own frantic notes from those first few weeks. He spread the largest map out, the one showing the official search grids from 2017. His fingers, stained with sawdust and faint traces of wood varnish, traced the neat red lines that sectioned off the wilderness. Grid 1A, 1B, 1C. Each section was initialed and dated by the search team leader who had cleared it. He found the grid that contained the old logging trail where Sarah's car had been discovered.
Section 4D.
His eyes scanned the corner of the box. Cleared. September 28, 2017. The signature beside it was bold and familiar. Sheriff J. Brody himself had led the team that had supposedly swept this exact area. David stared at the signature, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. Brody's words echoed in his mind. It's a big forest. Easy to miss. But Brody wasn't a man who missed things. He was meticulous, a former military man who prided himself on precision. David remembered him during the initial press conferences, speaking with such authority about the comprehensive nature of the search. He had looked David in the eye and promised him they were turning over every leaf. Could it have been an honest mistake? A team stretched thin, exhausted after days of searching, making a simple oversight? It was possible. It was the most logical conclusion. But it didn't feel right. The feeling that had started at the scene, the low hum of suspicion, was growing louder. He pulled out another folder, this one filled with witness statements. Most were useless, people who thought they might have seen a blue car, but couldn't be sure of the time or place. He sifted through them, his eyes bleary from exhaustion. He had to know. He couldn't let it rest on a simple assumption of incompetence. The discovery of the car had opened a door he thought was sealed forever, and he had to walk through it. He picked up the phone and dialed his brother's number. Michael answered on the second ring, his voice thick with sleep. "Dave? It's almost 2 a.m. What's wrong?" "They found her car, Mike," David said, the words feeling heavy and unreal. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then, a heavy sigh. "Oh, Dave. Where?" David explained the location, the hiker's call, the cold engine. He told him about the search grid, about Brody's signature. "What are you saying?" Michael asked, his voice now laced with a familiar, protective concern. "That the sheriff just missed it?" "Dave, these things happen. You can't start spiraling down this rabbit hole again. It almost broke you last time." "It's not a rabbit hole," David insisted, his voice rising with an intensity that surprised him. "It's a question." He signed off on the search for that area. He told everyone that it was cleared. "How do you miss a car?" "Because it's a forest, not a parking lot." Michael's voice was firm, trying to pull him back from the edge. They were looking for a person, a body, not a vehicle hidden under 6 years of brush. "Please, Dave, let the investigators do their job. Finding the car, it's a good thing. It's a piece of the puzzle. But it doesn't mean there's some conspiracy. Don't do this to yourself." David felt a familiar wave of frustration and isolation wash over him. Michael meant well. He always did. He wanted to protect his older brother from the pain that had hollowed him out for 6 years. But what he saw as a dangerous obsession, David was beginning to see as a necessary path. The official investigation had failed once. He couldn't blindly trust it to succeed now. "I have to go," David said abruptly. "I'm sorry I woke you." He hung up before Michael could argue further. He was on his own in this. He looked back at the map, at the confident scrawl of Sheriff Brody's name. Promise made. Promise broken. Was it an oversight, or was it a lie? The question burned behind his eyes. The discovery of the car had not brought closure. It had brought the agonizing, terrifying possibility of a new beginning. He had to know the truth, no matter what it cost him. The next morning, David drove into town. The fluorescent lights of the sheriff's department felt colder and more sterile than he remembered. The receptionist looked at him with a vague flicker of recognition and pity. He asked to see Sheriff Brody. He was told to wait. He sat on a hard plastic chair, his gaze fixed on a framed photograph of Brody shaking hands with the governor. A pillar of the community, a man you could trust. After 20 minutes that felt like an eternity, Brody's office door opened. "David, come on in." The office was exactly as David remembered it from 6 years ago. Wood-paneled walls, shelves lined with law books and commemorative plaques, a large American flag standing in the corner. Brody gestured to a leather chair opposite his wide, cluttered desk. He sat down with a heavy sigh, steepling his hands. He looked tired, but his eyes were steady. "I know this is hard," Brody began, his voice a practiced, soothing baritone. "Dredging all this up again after so long. Forensics is going over the car now. We should have a preliminary report by the end of the week. Maybe they'll find something we can use." David nodded, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I was looking at my old files last night," he said, keeping his voice as level as he could. "The search maps. From the original investigation." Brody's expression didn't change. "That was a long time ago." "You signed off on Grid 4D, David said, his eyes locked on the sheriff's. "The section where the car was found. You personally led that team." For the first time, a flicker of something crossed Brody's face. It wasn't guilt or surprise. It was annoyance. A flash of it, quickly masked by a weary smile. "David, I must have signed off on 24 grids. We were out there for weeks. My team and I swept 4D, yes, and we saw nothing. I can only assume the vehicle was further off the trail than we thought, or the foliage was even thicker back then. We were on foot in difficult terrain. We did the best we could with the resources we had." The explanation was smooth. It was reasonable. It was the same thing he had said yesterday. But hearing it again, in the quiet of this office, it sounded rehearsed. It sounded like a wall, built of plausible excuses, designed to stop questions. "You were so sure, though," David pressed, leaning forward slightly. "I remember you telling me. We are not missing a thing. Those were your words. It just seems strange to miss something that big." Brody leaned back in his chair, the leather groaning in protest. He picked up a pen from his desk, turning it over and over in his thick fingers. "Listen, David," he said, his tone shifting from sympathetic to firm, a parent correcting a child. "I understand your grief. I can't even imagine what you've been through. But you're latching onto a simple human error and trying to turn it into something it's not. My team and I made a mistake. It's a regrettable mistake and I own it. But that's all it was. We are doing everything we can now. You need to let us do our work. Going down these paths, questioning the integrity of the initial search, it's not going to help. It's not going to bring her back." The finality in his voice was a clear dismissal. The conversation was over. Brody stood up, a signal that David should leave. David rose slowly, his legs feeling heavy. He had come here for an answer, and he had received one. A neat, tidy explanation that closed the door on any further inquiry. But as he walked out of the office, the feeling of wrongness was no longer a quiet hum. It was a siren. Brody's calmness wasn't reassuring. It was chilling. It was the placid surface of a deep, dark lake, and David knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that something terrible was hidden in its depths. The sheriff wasn't just a man who had made a mistake. He was a man with something to hide. The sheriff's denial did not placate David. It ignited him. Brody's overly calm, dismissive explanation was the spark that turned the smoldering embers of suspicion into a fire. He drove home not with a sense of defeat, but with a grim, newfound purpose. If the official channels were a dead end, sealed by the very man he now suspected, he would have to find his own path. He spent the next 2 days immersed in the past, not just in the files of Sarah's disappearance, but in the life of Sheriff John Brody. He scoured old local news articles, property records available on the county website, and social media archives. He was looking for anything, any small inconsistency, any connection that might have been overlooked. Brody was a public figure, a man who had been sheriff for nearly 15 years. His life was an open book, but David was looking for the invisible ink between the lines. He found what he was looking for in a place he hadn't expected. The comments section of a 6-year-old news article about the search for Sarah. Buried deep among the messages of sympathy and speculation was a comment from a user named Deer Hunter 88. The comment was angry, complaining that the search had shut down access to his favorite hunting grounds. He specifically mentioned Brody, writing, "Funny how the sheriff's private road to his own cabin stays open, but the rest of us get locked out." The comment had been dismissed at the time, lost in the noise. But now it stood out to David like a flare in the night. Private road? A cabin? He cross-referenced the county property database again. this time searching for Brody's name outside of the town limits. And there it was, a 40-acre parcel of wooded land, registered to John Brody, situated on the far eastern edge of the state park, bordering private timberland. It was remote, secluded, and, according to the map, less than 5 miles from where Sarah's car had been staged. David felt a jolt of adrenaline, a feeling he had not experienced in years. This was something concrete, a location, a secret place. He printed out the parcel map, his hands shaking slightly. He couldn't go to the sheriff's department with this. Accusing the chief law enforcement officer of the county based on an old internet comment and a property record was career suicide for any deputy who listened, and lunacy for him. He needed more. He needed proof. He thought of Deputy Evans. She was young, knew enough that she might not be completely enmeshed in the established hierarchy of the department. She had looked at him with pity, yes, but also with a sharp, intelligent focus. She seemed professional, by the book. Maybe, just maybe, she would be willing to look at information objectively, without the bias of loyalty to her boss. He found her patrol car parked outside a diner the next morning. Taking a deep breath, he walked over as she was getting out. She recognized him immediately, her posture stiffening slightly. "Mr. Collier, can I help you with something? I know this is going to sound strange," he started, his voice low and urgent. "And I know how it looks, but I found something. I think it's important." He showed her the printout of the property map and a screenshot of the old comment. He explained his theory not as a wild accusation, but as a series of questions. Why was the cabin's existence never mentioned in the official reports? Why did Brody's search team so conveniently miss the car, which was located relatively close to his own private land? Evans listened patiently, her expression unreadable. She took the papers from him, her eyes scanning them. "Mr. Collier," she said, her voice careful and measured, "a man owning a hunting cabin is not a crime. And this comment is from an anonymous source 6 years ago. It's not evidence of anything, but it's a connection," David insisted. "It's a piece that doesn't fit. He lied to me, Deputy. I could feel it. He lied about the search." She handed the papers back to him. "Sheriff Brody is my superior officer. I can't launch an investigation into him based on your gut feeling and a map.
I'm sorry.
I understand you're looking for answers, but this isn't the way." Her tone was professional but final. It was another door shut in his face. He saw the calculation in her eyes. He was just a grieving father, lost in paranoia. Dejected, but not defeated, David knew he was truly on his own. If no one would listen, he would have to see for himself. That afternoon, he drove out towards the coordinates of Brody's property. He parked his truck on a public access road a half-mile away and made the rest of the journey on foot, moving through the dense woods like a shadow. He found the private road mentioned in the comment. It was unmarked, barely more than 2 dirt tracks disappearing into the trees, secured by a heavy metal gate with a large, industrial-looking padlock. He found a place to wait, a small hollow shielded by thick ferns, offering a clear view of the gate. For hours, he sat in the oppressive silence of the forest, the only sounds the buzzing of insects and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Doubt began to creep in. Michael's words, Evans's dismissal. Maybe they were right. Maybe he was chasing phantoms, constructing a conspiracy out of grief and coincidence. Just as the sun began to dip below the treetops, casting long, dark shadows across the woods, he heard the crunch of tires on gravel. A dark green pickup truck, one he recognized as Brody's personal vehicle, came down the public road and stopped at the gate. The sheriff got out, unlocked the padlock with a key, and swung the heavy gate open. He drove through, got out again, and locked it behind him. The truck disappeared down the dirt track. David's heart hammered against his ribs. So the cabin was in use. He waited. An hour passed, then another. Darkness fell, and a profound, unnerving quiet settled over the forest. Then he heard it, a low, mechanical hum, a generator. It was faint, but unmistakable, a modern sound in the ancient woods. Why would a simple hunting cabin need a generator running at this time of night? He was about to move, to try and get closer, when the headlights of another vehicle appeared, coming from the direction of the main highway. It was a nondescript white van, and it pulled up to the gate. A man got out of the driver's side, a heavy-set figure silhouetted against the headlights. He didn't have a key. He just waited. A few minutes later, the generator sound cut off abruptly. The woods were plunged back into silence. Then, a small light bobbed down the track from the direction of the cabin. It was Sheriff Brody holding a flashlight. Brody unlocked the gate for the van. As the vehicle's interior light flashed on for a moment, David saw a shape in the passenger seat. Person. Small. Slumped against the window. The van drove through the gate, and Brody locked it once more. He and the other man had a brief, quiet conversation, their words too low for David to hear. Then, the man from the van went to the passenger side and opened the door. What David saw next froze the blood in his veins. The man pulled a young woman out of the van. She was not fighting, but her movements were stiff, her face pale and blank with terror in the fleeting wash of the flashlight beam. She couldn't have been much older than Sarah was when she disappeared. Brody watched, his expression impassive, as the man led the terrified woman up the path toward the hidden cabin. This was not a cold case. This was not a memory. This was happening right now. The warm engine was not a ghost from the past. It was a sign that the machinery of this horror had never stopped running. Brody hadn't just failed to find Sarah. He was the monster in the woods that had swallowed her whole, and he was still feeding. The imminent danger was no longer a suspicion. It was a terrified girl being led into the darkness by the man who was supposed to be the guardian of the light. Panic seized David with an icy grip, but a lifetime of quiet resolve steadied his trembling hands. He scrambled back through the undergrowth, his mind racing, adrenaline singing through his veins. Every rustle of a leaf sounded like an approaching footstep. He had to get to his truck. He had to make a call. But who would believe him? He was a grieving, obsessed father making an insane accusation against the most powerful man in the county. He fumbled for his phone, his fingers slick with sweat. He couldn't dial 911. The call would go straight to the county dispatch, straight to Brody's people. They would dismiss it, or worse, they would alert Brody, and the girl would be lost forever. There was only one person he could call, one person who had at least listened, even if she had dismissed him. It was a desperate, terrifying gamble. He found Deputy Evans's card in his wallet, the flimsy piece of cardboard now feeling like the most important object in the world. He dialed the number, his breath coming in ragged gasps. She answered on the third ring, her voice crisp and professional. "Evans. It's David Collier," he whispered, his voice cracking. "He's here. Brody. At the cabin. He's not alone. He just brought a girl here, Deputy. I saw her. She's terrified. You have to believe me." There was a pause on the other end of the line. David could hear the faint sound of a car radio, the mundane world continuing on as his fell apart. "Mr. Collier, where are you?" Her voice had changed. The professional detachment was gone, replaced by a sharp, focused urgency. The raw, unvarnished terror in his voice had done what his maps and theories could not. It had made her believe. "His cabin," David gasped, giving her the location, the turnoff, the description of the gate. "He has a generator." He locked her inside. "Please, you have to hurry. God, you have to hurry. Stay on the line, Mr. Collier, and stay hidden. Do not approach the cabin. Do you understand me? I'm calling it in. I'm bypassing county dispatch and going straight to the state police. We're coming." The line went quiet, but he didn't hang up. He clutched the phone to his ear as if it were a lifeline, listening to the faint hiss of the open connection. He retreated further into the woods, his back pressed against the rough bark of a pine tree, his eyes fixed on the distant, dark path. The wait was the purest form of torture he had ever known. Every second stretched into a minute, every minute an hour. He imagined the horrors unfolding in that hidden cabin, and a fresh wave of nausea and fury washed over him. It was less than 30 minutes, though it felt like a lifetime, when he heard the distant sound of sirens. They were faint at first, then grew steadily louder before being abruptly cut off. A strategic silence. Minutes later, beams of light sliced through the darkness as multiple vehicles pulled up to the gate. He saw the silhouettes of state troopers in tactical gear, moving with quiet, deadly efficiency. Deputy Evans was there, pointing, directing. They breached the gate with a hydraulic tool that snapped the industrial lock with a sharp crack. David watched as the team advanced up the dirt road, their movements disciplined and swift. He remained hidden, a spectator to the storm he had unleashed. The team surrounded the small, dark cabin. A voice called out on a megaphone. "State police, occupants of the cabin, come out with your hands up." There was no response. The generator was still silent. The woods held their breath. After a tense minute, the team breached the front door with a battering ram. The sound of splintering would echoing through the trees. Troopers swarmed inside. David's heart pounded against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. After a few moments, 2 troopers emerged, escorting the heavy-set man from the van. He was handcuffed, his face a mask of sullen defeat. Then Sheriff Brody was brought out. He wasn't fighting. He wasn't shouting. He walked with a strange, unnerving calmness, his face placid, as if he were merely inconvenienced. The mask of the respectable public servant was still perfectly in place, a grotesque parody of normalcy. As they led him past, his gaze swept the darkness, and for a terrifying second, his eyes seemed to lock directly onto David's hiding place. There was no hatred in them, no fear, only a cold, flat recognition. Deputy Evans came back down the path, her face pale in the harsh glare of the headlights. She saw David emerging from the trees and came over to him. "They found the girl," she said, her voice strained. "She's alive. She's safe." Relief washed over David so powerfully his knees buckled. But it was incomplete. "And Sarah?" He choked out, the name a painful prayer. "Is there any sign of my Sarah?" Evans shook her head slowly. "The cabin is clear. It's just one main room and a kitchen. But there's something else." She pointed back toward the cabin. "There's a rug in the main room. It's bolted to the floor. And it doesn't look right." David's blood ran cold. He followed her back up the path, his feet feeling like lead. He stood in the doorway of the violated cabin. The air was stale, smelling of pine cleaner and something else, something metallic and faintly sour. He saw the large, dark red oriental rug in the center of the room. He saw the heads of the bolts securing its edges to the wooden floorboards. It was completely out of place. A trooper with a crowbar worked at the edges, prying the bolts free. They rolled the heavy rug back. Underneath, just as David had instinctively known, was a heavy, steel hatch, flush with the floor, with a modern combination lock set into its surface. It was a door to a place that was not supposed to exist. They brought in the girl they had rescued. She was wrapped in a blanket, her eyes wide and vacant with trauma. A female trooper spoke to her gently, pointing at the lock. The girl flinched, but after a moment, she whispered a series of numbers. An officer knelt and carefully turned the dial. With a heavy clank, the mechanism unlocked. 2 troopers heaved the heavy hatch open, revealing a steep set of concrete stairs descending into absolute blackness. The sour, metallic smell wafted up, stronger now, thick with the scent of damp concrete and human misery. A trooper shone a high-powered flashlight down the stairs. David pushed forward, ignoring Evans's hand on his arm. He had to see. He followed the beam of light down into the earth. The bunker was a concrete box, soundproofed and chillingly sterile. There were 2 rooms branching off a small central corridor. In the first, they found the rescued girl's belongings. In the second, David's world stopped. She was lying on a small cot, curled into a fetal position, facing the wall. Her hair, once a cascade of bright blonde, was long, matted, and pale. She was skeletal, a fragile collection of bones beneath a thin, gray tunic. But it was her. It was his Sarah. "Sarah?" he whispered, the sound catching in his throat, a broken, desperate thing. She flinched at the sound of his voice, but didn't turn. A trooper moved slowly into the room.
"Mom?"
You're safe now. We're the police. Slowly, hesitantly, she turned her head. Her eyes, once the brightest blue, were huge and sunken in her gaunt face. They were clouded with 6 years of darkness and fear. She stared at the trooper, then at David, standing in the doorway, his face a mess of tears. For a long moment, there was no recognition. Then a flicker, a tiny, fragile spark in the desolate expanse of her gaze. "Dad." The voice was a dry, unused whisper, a ghost of the voice he remembered. But it was hers. He stumbled into the room and fell to his knees beside the cot, his hand reaching for hers but stopping just short, afraid that she might shatter at his touch. She was alive. After 2,190 days of darkness, she was alive. The full, monstrous truth of her disappearance crashed down on him. She hadn't been lost. She had been stolen. She hadn't been missing. She had been caged, right here, beneath the feet of the man who had sworn to find her. The search hadn't failed by mistake. It had been a calculated, monstrous deception from the very beginning. The hours that followed were a disorienting haze of sterile environments and hushed, official voices. They were taken from the cabin to the nearest major hospital, a clean, quiet facility an hour away, far from the jurisdiction of the county sheriff's department. Sarah was admitted immediately, whisked away by a team of doctors and nurses who moved with quiet, compassionate efficiency. David was left in a small, private waiting room, a cup of untouched, lukewarm coffee growing cold in his hands. Deputy Evans stayed with him, a silent, steady presence in the chaos of his emotions. She was no longer just a police officer. She was the anchor that kept him from being swept away by the tidal wave of horror and relief. State investigators arrived, 2 men in plain clothes with tired, grim eyes that told him they had seen the depths of human depravity before. They spoke to him gently, their questions a necessary intrusion into his private cataclysm. He recounted everything, from the hiker's impossible phone call about the warm engine to the moment he watched Brody lead another victim into the woods. He told them about the search grids, about Brody's placid, chilling denial. As he spoke, the pieces of the puzzle began to click into place, forming a picture more grotesque than he could ever have imagined. Brody hadn't just stumbled upon Sarah. He had targeted her. The gas station where she had last been seen was remote. Her car, an older model, had been prone to problems. The investigators theorized that Brody had disabled her vehicle while she was inside paying, then played the part of the helpful local sheriff offering a ride. She would have trusted him. Why wouldn't she? The staging of her car, 6 years later, was the final arrogant act of a predator certain he was untouchable. One of the investigators suggested a motive. "He wanted to close the book," the man said, his voice low. Finding the car, but no body, would eventually lead to her being declared legally dead. It would mean a final end to the case file. No one would ever have a reason to look for Sarah Collier again. He could keep her forever, and on paper, she would have simply vanished in the woods. The warm engine was the detail that unraveled it all. A bizarre lie from a hiker that became an accidental, poetic truth. A signal that the crime was still active, still burning. Later, a doctor came to speak with him. He explained that Sarah was suffering from severe malnutrition, dehydration, and a host of issues related to long-term vitamin D deficiency. But physically, she would recover. The other wounds, the doctor said, looking David squarely in the eye, were deeper and would take much longer to heal. She was in a state of profound shock and dissociation. She had spoken only a few words, and her memories of the past 6 years were a fragmented landscape of terror. The other man, the one from the van, had been identified. He was a wealthy businessman from out of state. Under interrogation, he had confessed everything, implicating Brody as the mastermind of a small, depraved network. Brody had used his authority and his secluded cabin to traffic young women, catering to a select clientele who paid exorbitant sums for his monstrous services. The man from the van was just one of them. And then came the news about Brody himself. Confronted with the undeniable evidence, the living victims, the bunker beneath his cabin, the confession of his accomplice. His composure had finally irrevocably shattered. He had confessed. He recounted the abduction of Sarah 6 years ago with a chilling lack of emotion, as if describing a hunting trip. He detailed the construction of the bunker, his methods of control, his entire horrific enterprise. The pillar of the community was a monster of unimaginable cruelty. The confirmation of his guilt did not bring David satisfaction, only a profound, soul-crushing sadness. It brought validation for his desperate, obsessive quest, but it was a victory that felt like a gaping wound. Finally, they allowed him to see her. He walked into the quiet, dimly lit hospital room. Sarah was sitting up in bed, clean, wearing a soft hospital gown. She was staring at the window, at the distant lights of a city she had not seen in 6 years. She looked impossibly fragile, a porcelain doll that had been broken and painstakingly glued back together. He sat in the chair beside her bed. He didn't speak. He just sat there, breathing the same air as her. A simple miracle he thought he would never experience again. For a long time, she didn't acknowledge him. Then, her eyes shifted from the window to his face. They were clearer now, the fog of shock beginning to recede, revealing the deep, ancient pain beneath. She told him, in a voice that was little more than a whisper, fragmented pieces of her story. She spoke of the darkness, the silence, the sound of the generator, the only marker of an outside world. She spoke of Brody, of the terrifying duality of the man who was both her captor and the only human being she saw for years. He had told her that her father had given up looking, that everyone thought she was dead, that he was the only one who cared for her now. It was a psychological cage built around the physical one, designed to extinguish the last embers of her hope. Hearing the words from her own lips was an agony beyond measure, but David listened to everyone. He listened to the story of her survival, of the fierce, quiet resilience that had kept a part of her soul intact in the face of unimaginable horror. He had spent 6 years searching for his daughter, but she had spent 6 years fighting to survive, waiting for a rescue she had been convinced would never come. The wheels of justice began to turn with grim, unstoppable momentum. The case of Sheriff Brody became a national story, a shocking tale of corruption and depravity hidden in plain sight. His name, once a symbol of trust and authority, was now synonymous with evil. With his confession and the testimony of the survivors, the legal process was a formality, a slow march toward a judgment that could never truly balance the scales. But for David, the end of the search was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new, more difficult journey. Bringing Sarah home was not like welcoming her back from a long trip. He had gotten his daughter back, but she was not the same carefree, vibrant young woman who had driven away from a gas station 6 years ago. The girl he had lost was gone forever, replaced by a survivor who bore the invisible scars of her ordeal. The world was too loud for her, too bright. Crowds made her panic. A slammed door could send her retreating into a shell of silence for hours. Their house, once a place of happy memories, was now just a different kind of quiet room. David learned a new language, the language of trauma. He learned to read the subtle shifts in her posture, the flicker of fear in her eyes. He learned that healing was not a straight line, but a chaotic, unpredictable path, with days of progress followed by days of retreat. He learned patience on a scale he had never thought possible. Months turned into a year. Sarah worked with therapists both physically and mentally. She slowly began to reclaim pieces of herself. She started to walk in the garden, to feel the sun on her skin without flinching. She began to draw, filling sketchbooks with dark, abstract shapes that gradually, over time, began to incorporate hints of color. There were still long periods of silence, days when the darkness pulled her back under, but there were also moments of light. One crisp autumn afternoon, a little over a year after her rescue, David was sitting on the back porch, watching the leaves fall. Sarah came out and sat in the chair beside him, a rare, unprompted decision to join him. They sat in comfortable silence for a long time, watching the wind rustle the branches of the old oak tree in the yard. "I remember climbing that tree," she said, her voice soft, but clear. "You were so scared I was going to fall." David turned to look at her. A faint, sad smile was playing on her lips. It was the first time he had heard her speak of a memory from before, the first time she had willingly reached back into the world that had been stolen from her. Tears welled in his eyes, but he blinked them back, not wanting to break the fragile perfection of the moment. "I was," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I always was." She looked at him, her eyes, once so clouded, now holding a depth and strength that took his breath away. The bright, innocent girl was gone, but in her place was a woman of astonishing resilience. The journey ahead was long, and the echoes of the bunker would likely never fade completely. But in that quiet moment, sitting beside the daughter he had refused to lose, David felt a sense of profound, aching hope. He had not just brought his daughter home. He had stayed to walk with her, step by painful step, out of the darkness and back into the light.